Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is our last seminar of the semester, so welcome. And I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker, Paul Manning, for this seminar. I'll give you a brief bio about Paul. He's an undergrad, and people always think it's AC, and I'm like, AC on engineering? In fact, I'm like, oh no, the agricultural college, okay, in Truro. Now it's Dalhousie, the Faculty of Agriculture. But that's where he took his undergrad at AC, Agricultural College. He was the student president at that time at the college, and right now he's doing his DPhil, his PhD, and that's at the University of Oxford. And so I asked him, so, okay, now you're in Oxford, how did that happen? And very humbly, he mentioned that he has a Rhodes Scholarship, so congratulations, that's very, very prestigious. And he's a bug person, and I'm a water person. And so we're talking about those different aspects, and we actually met through Twitter. And shared information actively over Twitter, and Paul did this wonderful Bug of the Week thing. Little flashcards of bugs, different pictures, really cute. I thought they were cute, the artwork. Very attractive. So I'll let you add more to that. But please add more aquatic insects. And when I said that, he very willingly added some more aquatic insects. And here in Nova Scotia, I thought, why not, since he's here, invite him for a seminar. So he'll talk about his research and outreach. And here you are, Paul, and I'll hand it over to you. Welcome.
Hey everyone, thank you so much. It's really great to be here. And thank you, Dr. Campbell, for such a kind introduction to come here and speak today. It's a real delight. And great to see such a full house. My mom came all the way from Canning, which is really sweet. Made me really happy. As Dr. Campbell said, my name is Paul. Teaching now at the Faculty of Agriculture in Truro, and PhD student at Oxford. And I'm fascinated by insect diversity. I find it absolutely mind-boggling and interesting. And the thing about it is you can never learn too much because there is so much to learn. So I thought I'd just start out by making you guys a little more familiar about the wide range of species that we see and just how diverse insects are as a group. Oh. Oops. Okay, thank you.
Do you want Spencer? No, for referring?
No, it's fine. Just click is great. Super. Thank you. So this is a really great slide, a really great figure from a paper in PLOS in 2008. And in this study, this isn't my work, this is work by Snadden et al. What they did is they asked school-age children to draw what an ideal rainforest looked like. And this picture the part on the right-hand side of the figure shows the different groups of animals. So basically every kid drew lots of trees and vines, so no plants involved, but it looks at the different groups of animals. And what you see is almost everyone included a mammal, and almost every child included a bird. What was really underrepresented were the insects and the other invertebrates. The picture on the left-hand side is a really great way of visualizing these responses, where they drew the size of the insect as it corresponded to the frequency which it appeared in these figures. So you can see, in reality, these spiders and these ants are very, very tiny compared to these larger mammals and reptiles and birds. Let's go to the next slide. That's great. And what's pretty cool is if you think about the number of species on the world, we don't really know how many there are. There's a lot of uncertainty. Ranges from, we have 2 million in the lower boundary, upwards of 10 million, 15 million. Some estimates are even more liberal than that. But we know there's a lot of diversity. And from what we know so far, most of it tends to be in the invertebrates. So a described species is essentially any species that we know, we've given it a name, and we've published a description of what it looks like. And what we see is about 3/4 of those species are invertebrates. And an invertebrate is essentially a little animal with no bones. Great. So in this next slide, this takes all the invertebrates and jams them together. So what you see, as of the invertebrates, there's one group which is really dominating, and that is insects. So insects are any six-legged invertebrate that have external mouth parts. And what you see is they make up about 3/4 of the overall patterns of diversity that we see. So insects really tend to dominate over everything else. And this is from the same paper from Stadden et al. And what they did here is they, on the left-hand side, they made the size of the animal represent the actual biomass that it is within the forest ecosystem. So you see that insects, social insects, ants, and non-social insects, being the butterfly, and again with the invertebrate, the earthworm here, they really tend to make up most of the biomass in this ecosystem. And if you look over here, you can see the difference on the top between the child's perception of this diversity, and then on the right, the biomass, so the weight of these organisms, and on the left, the actual number of species. So there's a lot of discrepancy between how we perceive biodiversity and what it actually looks like. Great. So if you take all this and you want to distill it into one simple message, invertebrates are super diverse, and most of them are insects. So in the world, about half of all species that we have described are insects, and 1 in 5 of all described species is a beetle. So if you put your hand into a bag of species, pulled out 10, 2 of them are going to be beetles. So that's pretty crazy. Really, really interesting. Great. So insects have been very successful, and they've been allowed to diversify because they have 5 main characteristics that set them apart from other groups. So I thought what I would do now is just really gloss over those really quick to give you guys an idea of how this diversity happens, why they've been so successful. So the first reason is because insects are tiny. And if you've ever seen an insect, you probably know this quite intimately. So on this figure here, on the x-axis along the bottom, we have the length of the insect, all the way from 0 millimeters up to 30 millimeters. And on the y-axis, we have the abundance. So this looked at a bunch of sweep samples in a forest in Queensland, Australia. And what you see is the vast majority of insects fall under 6 millimeters in length. So it's about 90% of them are tiny, 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 so less than half a centimeter. 6 millimeters is about the height of 3 loonies stacked on top of one another. So we're talking tiny, tiny, tiny. This over here on the right of the slide is a wasp from New Zealand, which is the smallest insect in the world. There's a bunch of different species in this genus, and they are 0.135 millimeters in length. So that's about 1/8 the thickness of a sesame seed. Isn't that amazing? Like that tiny. It's crazy that they could find it, yet alone describe it. But that's what taxonomists are best at. And pretty fascinating, this little tiny wasp that exists and at such a small length. A second reason why insects have been very successful is because they have something called an exoskeleton. So it's a nice protective skeleton on the outside of their body. So instead of having bones, they have this armor. It's made of chitin. Chitin is very, very flexible. It's very lightweight, and it's very strong. So they have this wonderful, wonderful covering that keeps them protected. It keeps them from drying out, and it's been really integral in their success in diversifying as well. The third reason why they've been so successful is because they can fly. So out of all the invertebrates, insects are the only ones that have evolved the capability to fly. So if you can fly, you can find a mate, you can access new habitats, you can escape when danger comes. Having flight has been a really fundamental part of their evolution. Here's a little ladybird. Fourth reason is they have very, very high reproductive potential. So if you have a family, a typical human family, you might have 2 or 3 kids. An insect, a non-social insect, can have anywhere from 200 to 500. That's sort of in the ballpark of a normal family dynamic. If you're a social insect, like a bee, a termite, or an ant, it's not uncommon to have a lot more because you live a lot longer and there's specialization for the different parts of the colony which reproduce. So a termite queen, social insect, she can live about 10 years and she can lay upwards of 2-3 million eggs in their life. So that's a huge amount of eggs being produced. For the non-social insects, so things that don't live in colonies, like this moth here from Australia, this one has the world record for the number of eggs produced per individual of a non-social insect. And that's about 29,000. So this thing lives a couple weeks and just pops them out like crazy. Fifth reason, and this is probably one of the most fundamental reasons, is because they have something called complete metamorphosis. And complete metamorphosis is really just when an insect does different things at different times of its life. So if you think of a beetle or a fly or a caterpillar, like illustrated here, they start off as an egg, they hatch into a little larva, and that larva, its only thing that it does is eat. It's a mouth and a gut, right? Eat, 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 eat. Get as much food in as possible, store some energy. Turn into a pupa. At that point, you're rearranging, you're liquefying, turning into something completely different, and you pop out as an adult insect. So adult insects typically don't feed very much. Some of them don't feed at all. They're typically very short-lived, and really what they serve to do is they are a pair of sex organs with wings. So they fly around, mate, lay eggs, and they're dead. So you have different specializations depending on which part of the life cycle you're in. And what this also does is it prevents insects from competing with their own offspring for the same resources. So often you have a caterpillar feeding on like nice lush greens, and the adult butterfly, which would be kind of flitting around having a bit of nectar. So you see this different specialization. And this has been so successful that actually, if you look across species, just under 90% of species have this kind of development, which is called complete metamorphosis or holometabolism. So this has been fundamental in allowing these this group to speciate very quickly. And because they're so diverse and they're so abundant everywhere you go, they play really important roles in our ecosystems, whether they're terrestrial or whether they're aquatic. And they interact in really interesting ways. This is an example, like a very simple example of this tree here, balsam fir. We'll have this in our home in a few weeks for Christmas. We have a little caterpillar called spruce budworm that feeds on this. What's pretty cool is this wasp here is called a parasitoid. It lays an egg in the caterpillar. That egg hatches into a larva and then eats it from the inside out, killing it. So that's pretty weird. But this one is a hyperparasitoid, the one at the very top. And what that one does is it does exactly the same thing to the wasp larva as the wasp larva does to the caterpillar. So it's called a hyperparasitoid. It parasitizes a parasitoid. And you can have multiple levels. It's like the nesting dolls you have in Russia, right? It's a larva inside a larva inside a larva eating on a plant. So all these really weird trophic interactions. Now this particular example is actually much more complex when you consider that there are a bunch of different herbivores, a bunch of different parasitoids, and a bunch of different hyperparasitoids co-occurring in the same habitat. And this is actually, I think this is my favorite figure from any scientific paper ever, because it doesn't really mean much. But what you have here are the herbivores that are feeding on balsam fir in the rectangles. The little squares are their parasitoids. The circles are their hyperparasitoids. And then at the very top, we have viruses. So we have all these really interesting ways that organisms are interacting in very complex ways. And this is what we're faced with as ecologists to try to figure out what's happening in the system. And this is a pretty good example of things that are a little more complex than they might seem. I approach this through, I'm an agricultural ecologist, so I'm interested in how these interactions take place within the context of an agricultural field. So you can have, for example, for a tomato plant, you have pollinators that are allowing the plant to reproduce. You have herbivores that are acting as pests. You have parasitoids, the one we saw earlier. They are laying eggs and killing that thing from the inside out. And then you also have other natural enemies like ground beetles that just run along and find the caterpillar, chomp it down, have a nice tasty meal. So you've species that are interacting in all sorts of interesting ways within an agricultural context. And what's pretty cool when you think about an agricultural landscape is there's lots of smaller habitats within a field. And you can imagine, like we saw briefly before with the balsam fir food web, that the insects in this system are interacting in lots of really interesting ways. We have food webs that are intersecting food webs, from terrestrial to aquatic, in different host plants. you name it. There's a lot of different ways that the system can be complex. So often when you talk about insects in agriculture, you have this sort of dichotomy that's posed, which is insects are goodies or they're baddies. So there's things like pollinators that are helping you pollinate your crops. And then you also have pests that are directly harming your yields by eating what you're trying to grow. And what's pretty cool to think about too is often we talk about these things that are good and bad, but there's a lot of things in agricultural systems that aren't really playing any direct role in influencing the yield of your crop. So lots of things are kind of serving in as they're there, but not really active agents in this system for producing or reducing yield. So what I'm really interested in as an ecologist is looking at the effects of agricultural intensification. So as we move to feeding growing population, one of the reasons, or one of the things we're doing to do this is we're taking small, quite diverse habitats, and we're converting them into these larger fields with less plant diversity and less diversity associated with basically every group that's in this field. So you see this real reduction of diversity and also these interesting interactions where you have a chemical pesticide being applied that can shift everything that's happening, or a plow coming through and moving things the other way. So you have all sorts of, again, interesting interactions taking place. This is a really nice illustration of how different groups within agricultural fields respond to intensive management. So this compares organic versus conventional fields, which is a nice pair comparison. It looks at across 184 different studies. On the y-axis here, this 0 dotted line represents the average for conventional production. And then this is the relative benefit, these blue bars, in the number of species that are supported by converting to organic agriculture. So you see different groups respond differently. Producers, plants, tend to have the highest response because herbicides are really bad for plants. Go figure. But overall, we see about a 30% increase in species richness, when so the number of species present in a system when we're farming less intensively. So the question that I'm interested in as a researcher is, what does this loss of diversity mean for production? And I'm specifically interested in insects because that's the group that is the best group and the most interesting group. They're really cute. So one way you can approach this is looking at these insects that provide beneficial services. How does loss of their diversity affect yield? And then you can sort of build on that and say, is there an applied reason why we as land managers and farmers would want to conserve this diversity? So I thought I would just start by bringing up a few examples of different ways that insects benefit production, and go into a little more detail about some studies in the literature that look at these questions. So probably the best known group of beneficial insects are pollinators. So anytime you pick up a paper, you see that bees are in decline, and this is pretty widespread across species. But pollinators are essentially insects that help plants have sex. So you have, if you need a seed in the case of canola or a lima bean, or if you need a fruit in the case of an apple or a blueberry or cranberry, you need insects to move the pollen from the male parts of one plant to the female parts of the other. So these guys are really fundamental in allowing production to take place. When we talk about bees, often people start by saying, okay, bee, the European honeybee. It's actually a lot more diverse than that. There's about 20,000 species of bees found globally. In Nova Scotia, we have between 200 and 300, if my memory is correct. And it's not atypical within a single system like a backyard garden or a blueberry field to find a couple dozen species. So these guys are all pollinating sometimes different plants, sometimes the same plant, but they all provide some sort of level of pollination for a crop. And so next slide we'll talk a little bit about what diversity means. So I really like meta-analyses. This one's in current biology last year. And what this did is it looked at what the benefit of conserving bee diversity was for economic yield. So on the x-axis, we have the species rank. So the more common species are down towards my end, and the more rare species are at the other end of the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have a logarithmic scale looking at the value that this species provides. And essentially, all we're seeing is that there is some bee species, so each of these dots is a species. The ones that are providing the most value are the ones that are really common. So if we just use this idea that, okay, we want to maintain species-rich pollinator communities because they provide economic services, that's not going to add up, because it's the common ones, the ones that are most abundant, that are really driving the high economic value. And if you're producing pumpkins and you need pollination, you're going to be more concerned about these really, I mean, from a production perspective, you're going to be most concerned about the ones that really pack the most pollinator punch. Another way we can talk about insect diversity being beneficial is through acting as biological control agents. So I mentioned this briefly in a couple slides ago. We have beetles. This guy's a ground beetle. Worked on these for a while. They're really interesting. Flightless. They run around and eat things. And you can imagine how that would directly reduce pest populations in the field. Over here we have, this is a parasitoid, so a little wasp laying an egg in the aphid, just like we saw earlier with the balsam fir and herbivores on those. So these are two kind of complementary ways that insects can reduce pest populations. In this next study, what they did is they compared a great bit by Snyder et al. We have monocultures, so just one species in communities, and then 5 different species. And then over here, we have exactly the same 5 species, but just with one species removed from each of the communities. So we have this nice paired effect of monoculture versus polyculture. On the y-axis, we have aphid density. So if you're producing food, you want your aphid density low. You don't want aphids that are pretty notorious for knocking back your yield. And what you see is it's a bit confusing, so it takes a second to look, but this dotted dashed line represents the mean from the other side. So with high diversity, we have lower suppression than almost all of these monocultures. But over here, we see that the mean from this side, almost every single polyculture outperformed the monoculture, or the mean of the monocultures. So a really nice comparison showing that because these insects have different strategies, some might feed on the ground, some might feed on the stem, some might parasitize, we have this nice complementary service happening where more species means higher levels of pest control. Okay, so now getting into my stuff. I'm interested as a scientist in dung decomposition and the associated benefits that decomposition provides in an agricultural context. So dung is produced by a large animal, lots of undigested plant matter still occurring in the feces, and insects love it. Come along, chomp through that old plant matter, chomp through some microbial biomass, and they're pretty happy. So it's a really nutrient-rich food source that these insects are exploiting. Just to give you a scale of how much is produced, this is a quick mock-up of 13 million cows in Canada producing 30 kilograms of dung per day. It's mostly water, but 30 kilograms a day. If you made a big stack, it would be higher, wider, and longer than the height of the CN Tower over the year. So that's 142 million tons produced annually. Probably, I mean, it's not really easy to measure as a quantity or even visualize as a cube, but yeah, it just knows a lot of dung being produced, and we'd be up to our necks in it if it weren't for insects and other invertebrates. So I work specifically on beetles that feed on dung. They're really cute, and they're really fun, and they're really easy to manipulate within an experimental context. So these guys feed on dung both as larvae and as adults. And where I was in the UK, there was about 45 species. Kind of a typical species richness for a community might be between 3 and 5 species. So I mean, nationally they're quite species rich, but on a local scale they're less so. And about 6,000 to 7,000 species described globally, depending on what you consider a dung beetle and what you don't consider a dung beetle. So here's in this picture here just some. And then on the right-hand side, some of the dung beetles we have in the United Kingdom that I was working with during my PhD. So when insects colonize dung, eat it, and lay their eggs, and their larvae eat it, we have a lot of beneficial things that occur as a result of that. So we find that pasture grass is more productive, often has higher nitrogen content and phosphorus content. There's a lot of greenhouse gases fluxing from cow dung. And when you introduce beetles that aerate this and break it up, you actually have less methane production, so it can reduce the GHG gases coming from your field. It actually is enough to turn a pasture from a net source to a net sink of GHGs. So they're really, really effective in doing that and helping prevent global warming. Dung is actually a really important way that parasites spread. So if there's a dung pat sitting on a pasture, parasites can leave and reinfect other cows that are grazing closely. So dung beetles help reduce the number of parasites that leave this dung and reinfect other animals. You see that the soils are more biologically active when you have dung beetles present. Plants can deal with stress better. You find that actually the physical removal allows more grass to grow, so like a really obvious direct benefit of reduced pasture fouling. There's less fecal pathogens on produce in blueberry systems, and yeah, so there's lots of different ways they can benefit the soil and help keep production going well. So these are the 4 that I use in my experiments during my PhD. You can see they feed in slightly different ways. So this big bruiser, Photius fossor, he's about a centimeter long, and they lay their eggs in between the soil and the dung. This guy, Photius ater, lays his eggs up in the top. Some of them dig little tunnels and make they're called dung sausages when they make these little balls of dung lay an egg. They're really cute. And then some of them are jacks of all trades, master of none. They just do whatever they want depending on the system. They can also act as like a sort of predator of other species too in rare circumstances. So just what I want to get here is these are the 4 species that I use. They all kind of do different things within the dung pat. And actually these 4 species are all introduced to Canada, which is great. So I can continue my PhD work over here and just, yeah, find the same species, chuck them in a bucket, have lots of fun. Okay, so the actual way that I approach this is something called biodiversity ecosystem functioning relationships. And this is a pretty hot topic in ecology. It's been a hot topic in ecology for a long time. We've been around the world with it a few times, but basically people have finally said, okay, there is some positive relationship between the number of species and the amount of functioning. So in this case, we have dung, which is undecomposed. On the top of the y-axis here, we have dung, which is decomposed. The more species that you have, the more complementarity you see. So in the case that they're feeding on this part of the dung, or this part of the dung, or this part of the dung, you'll see that there's more. But this relationship is typically saturating. So you see it's positive, but in some cases, and this is, I want to just be clear, this is a really hypothetical example. Because, I mean, it might not be 2 species where it saturates. It might be 7 or 9. But what you typically see is you don't need all the species present in a community to maximize functioning. So some level of benefit associated with more species, but not, you don't need every single individual. That's like we saw with the bees earlier. So some benefit of species richness, but you don't need every single one. But I'm really interested by this idea of functional redundancy. And it's something that I write about a lot and I have thought about a lot. And there's 2 main reasons why this idea that species are redundant in an ecosystem is a bit flawed as a way of approaching it. And the first is systems are likely to be disturbed. So you picture a tomato plant. If it gets clocked with an insecticide, it might be important to have that 6th species or that 7th species there to fill in if they're less susceptible to insecticide use. So the one that I work on looks at a chemical which is widely given to animals to cure internal parasite burdens. So the same mechanism which kills the little worm in the cow's stomach passes through in the dung without any metabolism occurring. So the same toxic mechanism which kills the little worm in the stomach also kills any invertebrate which colonizes the dung. So you see a real peak like a couple days after you feed it, or after you administer the medication, depending on a bunch of different environmental factors. But essentially, if you give cows veterinary medicines, they produce toxic dung at some point for a certain period of time. And the other reason why is because typically from an ecosystem, we're demanding a lot of it. So there's lots of things that we need to occur, or we need to happen in order to get what we're looking for. So in an agricultural system with dung beetles, an example, the 4 things I look at how porous the soil is. So if you have a really compact soil, you're not going to have much root extension. I look at dung removal, which is just a good measure of how much grass will be available on the pasture surface. I look at the biological activity of soils, this little bioassay called a bait lamina stick. You shove them in the ground and you can compare it's like a little plastic stick with holes, and you can shove it in, you fill it with cellulose, you pull it up after a certain exposure period, and a biologically active soil, you can see right through all the holes, and one that's very polluted or has no invertebrates present, you'll see that it's just opaque. So it's a quick way of monitoring how active a soil is. And the third thing I looked at was measure of grass growth. So just took a soil sample, chucked some seeds on, and saw how much production took place. And because all these things are important from a pasture production context, there are different ways that you can combine them all together in a measure called multifunctionality, which is a simultaneous delivery of multiple ecosystem functions. And my research fits in right here between these 2 different caveats, so perturbation and multifunctionality. So I'm really interested in what is the importance of dung beetle diversity in supporting ecosystem functions, and how is that affected by perturbation, which is the ivermectin chemical given to the cows to get rid of the parasites. So just to be clear, because it's not clear when you look at the graphs, but what I did is I used every single possible combination of these 4 common species. So these guys occur basically in any habitat you can think of from an agricultural perspective. So they're on really intensive farms, they're on organic farms. You'll find them wherever you look. And they're standardized based on the weight of beetles. So every single enclosure has, well, I think it was like I don't know, roughly 12 medium-sized beetles, whatever that weight was. I have no idea right now in my head. So we have all the possible combinations from 1 species all the way up to 4. And then what I did after that, if you go to the next slide, we poisoned half of them. So half of these beetles were given dung with this ivermectin in it. And that would have both lethal and sublethal effects with possible ability to reduce the amount of function that we see. So I'm going to run you by through the 4 different functions. So on the x-axis, we have the number of species. And I can only show a subset, but it actually is every possible combination. So there's no sampling effect here where you just happen to get a more effective species at the higher levels of richness. And what we see is there's, in the blue, so the control, without the ivermectin, you see a slight positive relationship between diversity and functioning when it comes to grass growth. And that wasn't the case in the, when it was disturbed with the ivermectin. Also for note, throughout these slides, these little dashed lines along the bottom represent a control without any beetles. So you can just see the relative effect of adding beetles. So they have dung, but no beetles added. So we see this positive effect. Okay, when it comes to these soil sticks, these bait lamina sticks, wasn't powerful enough to detect anything happening, or wasn't any effect. So we didn't see any benefit of having species-rich dung beetle assemblages in supporting more biologically active soil, and we also didn't see any effect of ivermectin in influencing how fast these little bits of cellulose degraded. When you look at soil bulk density, so again, when you add dung beetles, you can see most of these fall well below the beetle-free controls. So beetles have a pretty strong effect in reducing the tunneling activity. Really does break that up. It allows it to be more porous, but there's no effect of diversity or of ivermectin in influencing this behavior for these species that I considered. Dung removal is sort of like the key way people measure how effective a dung beetle community is. And what we see here is that there is an effect of ivermectin. So ivermectin means less dung being consumed, again, through a combination of lethal and sublethal effects. But biologically, it's not a very significant difference between the 2 different groups because, yeah, you can see there, it's like a difference of 36 to, or 30 to 28. So it's statistically significant, biologically, not so much. But what's really cool is we need all these things to happen at once. So there are different ways that you can build models that allow you to test the effect of diversity across a suite of functions. I've got a few different metrics, so I'm going to show you the most straightforward one to explain today because the others are a little bit, you need to do a little bit of background reading to really get them properly. It took me a long time to get my head around. But what this next slide will be is it'll show you, you standardize these functions to the same scale, and you take a mean across the 4 functions, and then you have some standardized metric which allows you to know how species richness and perturbation affect the simultaneous delivery of multiple functions. That's a mouthful. Holy. And what you see here, and I was really pleased with this result. So you see that there's a slightly marginally non-significant interaction here. So there's only really an effect of ivermectin. But you can see that it starts off at low species richness. It doesn't really matter whether it's perturbed or not. But once you get to high levels of species richness, you have much higher levels of functioning when you have no ivermectin compared to the presence of ivermectin. So ivermectin seems to take away the benefit of maintaining a species-rich assemblage from a functional perspective. So that was probably the best result for my PhD. I'm pretty pleased with it. Just the take-home message here. Dung beetle diversity doesn't seem to play a really important role in supporting individual functions. And I think part of that is because you have every possible combination that adds a lot of noise. So it's hard to tease that apart. So the benefit of diversity seems to be higher when you consider multifunctionality. So when you put all these functions together at the same time, it's a better indicator of the importance of maintaining diversity in this system. And also, the third part is the use of these products can undermine the benefits provided by dung beetles. There's lots of literature that supports this. But also it's really cool because there's a lot of things you can do as a farmer to reduce the impact of parasiticide treatment. So a big part of this research is also trying to communicate this with producers and help them make more environmentally sensitive decisions when they're treating their livestock for worms. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So this came into my head quite often, and I'm writing about these things. I write, oh, there's no importance of maintaining dung beetle species richness. That's fine. It just felt a bit weird, and often as ecologists we tend to use this kind of ecosystem services mindset to get people to care about insects. But it wasn't really the reason that I love insects, or my friends loved insects, or people that I met on the street and talked about insects would decide to love insects. So I thought I would do a little project to kind of promote other ways that insects are cool and interesting. And this is, again, how I met Dr. Campbell. And the question that I thought about was, does anyone really decide to appreciate something because of the service it provides? So we talk about bees, and yes, bees might be like the one example where we love them because we love oranges, or not oranges, that's not a good example, they're not bee-pollinated, apples or blueberries. That's enough reason. But even if there is some functional benefit of this group in producing a product or a service, often this isn't enough as an argument by itself to justify the conservation of a wide group of species. So like we saw with the bees, you only need the really common ones to have this service being provided. But despite this, ecologists use this framework all the time to try to get people to care about biodiversity. And especially insect diversity, because insects, I mean, people aren't really into insects. It's one of those things that people typically don't love. An insect is a pest, an insect might bite me, an insect might give me a disease. But we still keep trying to hammer this out. So I think a really important message is trying to share other reasons why insects are cool. And I have on the next slide, this quote from Louis C.K. I thought really sums it up nicely, which is, I hate bats. And I'm sure there's a whole thing like, oh, did you know how bats make all the French toast in the world? Whatever, I don't care. I still hate them. So making a play on the fact that bats, like insects, provide some service. If you hate them, it doesn't matter what they do for you, you're still going to hate them. So there's an important role of us trying to educate people about the other benefits something can provide aside from the ecosystem service side of things. So I put together this little project where I was drawing insects and just trying to share that they're beautiful, strange, wonderful, surprising, and perplexing organisms, and they're worthy of closer attention by everyone. So this is the way I tried to do it with this little social media project called Bug of the Week. I did it on Twitter and also on a website. And had a bit of a mixture of success and failure with it. So I thought I'd share that with you, and hopefully you might learn something new about what it was like to do this. Yeah, so my project aim was to create and share media that concisely demonstrated the beauty and diversity of insects to a diverse audience. So the create component, I managed to actually stick to my task, despite it being an absolute nightmare some days to wake up and draw an insect and research it and put it all together. But managed to get 52 insects featured in the year. And I got one thing was cool, a nice little secondary benefit was learning how to use GIMP, which is like a free version of Photoshop that I couldn't use at all. Then by the end, I was getting pretty good at it. So that was nice. It was good. I built a pretty steady audience over the timeline. People were interested, signing up by email and by Twitter and websites. Got it shared in a few different websites and in one print magazine, which is cool. On Twitter, it was seen 250,000 times. Interacted with, which means it was clicked or shared or liked 2,400 times. And then website visits got 13,000 over a year. So I thought that's a pretty good metric for sharing something. It wasn't a very diverse audience, so it was mostly English-speaking Western countries. UK, where I was featuring UK species often, really dominated. US, Canada. There's some weird discrepancies here with the languages. I think people have maybe tweeting in English and it's all from Twitter analytics. People are tweeting in English and Spanish, so it's up to over 100%. That's my interpretation anyway. But yeah, it was mostly Western English-speaking countries, so maybe in the future I try to get an interpreter or a translator to change it up a little bit and see if I could reach a more broader audience. Again, this is where my biggest failure was. The people, if you look at the interests of the people that are following along the account, their interests are science, news, biology, and documentaries. So I think in this case, I was really preaching to the choir, which is like, oh. But you know, you do what you can. Next time I'd find a different avenue to share things. Audience was slightly female biased, and most of them between the ages of 25 and 35. I was thinking it would be more suitable for like younger kids, but then I found out young kids don't use Twitter. I thought it was like a new millennial tool, but I guess like Twitter's gone the way of Facebook, and I should have been doing it on Snapchat or something else. So out of touch. But what I thought I would do is just share some of the highlights from my features, because that's the part that I'm really most passionate about insects, is sharing this information and teaching people about how cool insects are. This is pretty cool because I got to meet someone who did this really fantastic work doing citizen science at Colby College in Maine, and works on this great little bug called the soapberry bug. It was confined to one small vine in Central America and parts of Florida, and then it made a host switch to a Chinese tree that was introduced, and now you can find them. They're basically spreading, migrating up from the center point, and this group is doing work to kind of document how they're spreading and the evolution of these insects, and looking at all sorts of interesting things. They're funded by the NSF, and it's a really great project. So I was able to talk to him a little bit at a conference, and then featured his soapberry bugs in a little feature, which was cool. So hopefully that might have helped him get one or two people looking for soapberry bugs. So that was a nice little bonus. The next one was myth-busting male mosquitoes. And I'm not sure if one of these things that kind of keeps coming up again and again and again is people think crane flies, Topulidae, these big bumbly, you know the ones that come out in autumn, they like bounce along the, not very good flyers. They're big and weird, and people think they're male mosquitoes. And like I've heard this from like dozens of people say, you know that one of these is actually a male mosquito, and they just go up to a pond where the mosquito eggs are, and they just inseminate the whole water, and all of the eggs are impregnated. And I was like, I don't think that's how it works. It's actually a crane fly. They develop in the soil. But I shared this on Twitter and Facebook, and some friends saw it, and were like, oh, wow, that's not a male mosquito. I was like, no, it's not. So that was pretty cool, just educating my inner circle of friends, which is kind of fun. This one here I was really proud of this drawing. I thought it turned out really cool. It's a scarab. Setonia radia. It's a jewel scarab of sorts, and it feeds on roots as a larva, and then it feeds on foliage of roses as an adult. And often this one gets put down as a pest because it has this annoying habit of feeding on our garden plants. But I think it's really, really beautiful. And it's super chunky. It's about 2 centimeters long, and you can hold it, and it just kind of rolls around in your hand, and super cute. But yeah, a gardening magazine and their Twitter account picked it up and shared it. So that was kind of cool, knowing that that message might have gotten to some people who were in their gardens, and maybe next time, instead of spraying, just kind of appreciated it and let it go on its way. This one's great, the egg-flicking fly. This is Bombylius major. We have this in Nova Scotia and really across all northern parts of the world. And this is a fly that is super, super cute. Looks like a pom-pom, grew wings and a nose. And what you see it doing in the spring, it comes up quite early, and you see it hovering over the ground, and it has this really sort of, it looks kind of Star Wars-y. It dips its abdomen like that. And what it's really doing is it's flicking eggs out of its ovipositor, so its egg layer in the back of its abdomen, and it's shooting them down these little holes where solitary bees live. And those larvae then parasitize the bee and eat the honey or the pollen and the nectar that's stored for them, and they eventually often kill the host. But I thought that was really cool. Like, motherhood for this fly is literally shooting a baby out of your backside into a hole in the ground. And it just makes me laugh. Anyway, a scientist at the Natural History Museum in London wrote to me to say she really enjoyed that, and she's a Diptera expert, so that was a really nice moment. I mean, reaching this again, preaching to the choir, but it was still pretty cool. This is the last one before I do a few more things. This is the peacock butterfly, and where I was living as an expat, it was kind of cool to see this butterfly had done the exact opposite journey. So this has come over now. There was one spotted in 1994 in Montreal. It's dead common all across Europe and Asia and parts of Africa. It's a very common butterfly. It feeds on nettles. They found one in 1994 in Montreal, and then since then they found one or two in Montreal, some in Trois-Rivières in Quebec, and some in Halifax. So these guys have actually come over. They overwinter as adults under the bark of trees, or in the case of these ones, on shipping containers, have made it over, and they have small populations. So keep your eyes peeled for this really gorgeous butterfly called the peacock. It's coming to a nettle patch near you. And I thought I would share the most popular posts. The first one was the last one I did, so built an audience, I guess, as I went along. It's the world's largest bee. It's huge. It's super chunky. I've seen the original specimen. It's amazing. So first discovered in 1858 by Wallace as he was exploring Indonesia. And they hadn't found a single one again until 1981. Turns out they were living inside termite colonies in trees, making these weird resin cases. And now they have a few different sites where they have this occurring reliably. And it's not as rare as I think it is. But even locals living there had no idea this bee existed. But it's chunky. I don't know, chunky for an insect. It's huge. It's really, really cool. That's the female. I was really pleased with this because a parasitic fly made one of the most popular posts. And what it is it's very flattened. So you see them on bats. It's a hippoboscid fly. And they're super dorsal ventrally flat. It's like someone dropped a big book on it. They have really malformed wings that don't actually function for flight. And what they do is they grab onto a bird, in this case a swift, and they hold on really close, bury their head in, and feed on their blood. Then they go back to the swift's nest. They give birth to live larvae, which is something pretty unusual for insects generally. And the larvae then attack or parasitize the offspring of the bird that it fed from. So pretty cool. And it was good to see a parasitic fly being shared quite widely. That was great. This one's cool. I did this one for National Insect Week. I got paid a little bit, which is sweet. This is a big PR campaign for insects in the UK. And this is a common drone fly. And this one's quite cool because people often think it's a bee, so it's a very good bee mimic. But it doesn't sting. These guys feed on nectar and pollen, so they are pollinators in some ways, probably not as effective as bees. The larvae live in water. They have big, long tails that look like rats. They're pretty gross. They often feed in like rotting manure too, so you can find them in barns sometimes. This is quite cool because often when journalists write stories about bee declines, they include a picture of this fly. And it's like 1 time out of 10, it's like, oh, again. And the entomologists are like, oh, that's not even a bee, that's a fly. It's really common grievance that people have. So it's cool. Hopefully maybe a journalist would have saw this and thought next time maybe I should count the wings and make sure it's a fly, not a bee. This one, again, this is a Nova Scotia. Oh, the last one was Nova Scotian too, or also worldwide. But this one's that you find in Nova Scotia quite commonly. Anyone seen this one? Green tiger beetles. They're super speedy, super fast, super cute, really shiny, iridescent green. They live in sandy soils. They dig these big, deep, long tunnels. And the larvae kind of pop out like jack-in-the-boxes and grab things that run by and dip back down again. So they're really, really cool. Called six-spotted tiger beetle, but the number of spots varies depending on the individual. There's a lot of variation there. But it's the only bright green one we have. And last one, I was really pleased with this because it's a moth, and moths always have this bad rap as being dull, drab, nocturnal. This is a diurnal, so day-flying, crazy bright-colored moth that's huge. So it's the wingspan probably about 3 centimeters in total. And you can find it in really high densities locally. So in my garden in Oxford, one day, I think we had 30 or 40 of them in a square of land that wasn't much bigger than 4 by 4 meters. So it was great. Really special moth, and glad to see people learning a little bit about moths and understanding how beautiful and interesting they can be. So a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really worthwhile exercise in scientific communication. Content got way easier to make as I went along, got faster and faster. Made some cool new connections. I'm here today because of this project, which is really exciting, coming to give a talk to you folks. But I think really need to think a little more critically about how to engage a diverse audience and share these messages when you're trying to talk about conservation or the importance of insect diversity or what an insect is. It's pretty easy to get siloed in the groups you're most familiar with. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot. So I thought I'd just give you guys a really final run through. Hope you remember that insects are really, really diverse, and they play a lot of really important ecological roles in our natural ecosystems, in our managed ecosystems. This one I need to hammer home 100 times. So it's my pet peeve that I've been fighting about. I think we need to be sure that insects as ecosystem service providers, things that provide pollination, things that control pests, things that decompose dung, isn't the standalone reason why we justify conserving insects. There's a lot more to insects than just having some sort of service provided by them. Again, it seems to be a pretty good appetite. I was surprised by how popular this project was relative to my expectations, but it seems like the insect community is quite siloed and compartmentalized, so it would be good to think about ways to reach a wider audience and get them engaged and caring and thinking about this a little more critically. And finally, this is one thing I think is pretty cool, is throughout this I always do a lot of in-person outreach with kids and with adults, and I find that really the best way to get someone excited is to give them an insect and let them hold it and let them guess, well, what does it do, where do you find it, why do you think it looks like this, and that's when you really make those meaningful connections. I don't think anything will really replace that. Anyway, this is the one, simultaneously doing this, I want to show you guys this, because this is pretty cool. This is my biggest success in scientific communication, which is pretty sad. So this is a video of dung beetles. It's a species called Anaplotropes stercorosus, which is a great name by itself. Commonly called a door beetle. They're quite fat, chunky little things. They're iridescent blue-purple, and they, here I have them getting ready for an experiment, just feeding on some horse dung. So I put this on, there's a now defunct website called Vine, which is a social media thing for a while that was quite popular. Now it's been being shut down. But I posted it on there, and I have no one following me, and I just posted it, and no one saw it. And then 8 months or 6 months later, my phone started to ping. And I looked down, and there was like 99 notifications from Vine, and I looked and I cleared it, and it was 99 again. So this thing went viral. So if you go to the next slide, you can see about 400,000 people looked at it now. So people were widely sharing this video and talking about it with their friends, and I actually managed to reach a really diverse audience. So I was going to share some of the reflections from the audience in the next slide. So if you just hit once. So there's, so the first one looks at, I reached an international audience. So this is anyone speak this language? Russian, yeah, what does it say? Anyone familiar with it? It says bon appetit or something of the like. We have this one here with the Pokemon who use emojis. So this is, again, probably a teenager. Some people got pretty emotive, nasty, what in the world, ew. Conehead Crew X, Julia, said, first of all, it's freaking poop, so chill. They can say whatever they want. It's nasty as hell. Wolf Girl gave some business advice. If you got a bug expert to look at those beetles about a few months ago, you get yourself some fine money. I thought that was great. And this is my favorite one, this girl here who said, people might say it's gross, but they have lives and souls too. It wasn't a choice to be a bug, so stop being mean. So a staunch defender of insects, which I thought was really great. So thanks so much. I had some great funding to be over in Oxford, the Rhodes Trust and through NSERC, my lab group, Dr. Bean's Bug Farm, where I do my research, and the University of Oxford for giving me a place to work and cool people to talk to and all that fun stuff. So thanks to all of you for coming, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. We have some time for some questions from the audience. Any questions about his research presentation, please feel free.
Hi, I like the presentation a lot, and I was curious how specialized are dung beetles, so that if you have in an agricultural field just one type of species, would it change it if you added in multiple types of species of different animals?
Yeah, so there tends to be a little bit of preference, but it's not actually specialization. So you'll have some will do better with harder, kind of more fibrous dung like a sheep dung. So you'll see that some of the ones that make the tunnels will prefer that, but typically they'll get whatever they can take, or they'll take whatever they can get. So if you have a field where you have one species, for example, feeds on rabbit droppings, and it's like, oh, this only feeds on rabbit droppings, but in practice you can find it feeding on just about anything provided rabbits aren't there. So there is, some sort of preference, but no real specialization. But in tropics, it's very different because some things specialize on snail mucus, but they're still dung beetles. So it depends where you are in the world. But yeah, good question.
I was wondering if you had looked at all at Entophagia and popularizing that in Canada, in the North American audience, because it's so common around the world for people to consume insects as a source of excellent protein.
Yeah.
Are there any insects here in Nova Scotia or in Canada that could be a suitable
Well, I think when it comes to entomophagy, it's probably safest. I mean, I'm not an expert in entomophagy, but I have lots of friends who work on it. It's a really interesting question. So insects, really high in protein, really easy to rear, very small environmental footprint, and really high conversion of feed to protein. There are some that you could do. So June bug larvae are pretty good because they are a scarab that's feeding on grass. People are eating those. But the ones that are tried and true are the mealworms and the crickets, which you can really buy at any pet store, and those are the ones that are typically being reared on mass scale. There's actually some research happening at the Dalhousie Faculty of Agriculture where people are working on value-added projects or products with these insect proteins. So yeah, there is some.
What about in terms of what they feed the insects? What's safe to? Are there any products that are less safe in terms of?
There are some sort of, yeah. So I guess one of the big challenges to producing insects for feed is inconsistency in food waste. So if you're looking at restaurant waste, you might find that there would be just variable quality, variable moisture. So it can be challenging from that perspective. You might deal with fungus or bacteria infecting. But when you have large amounts of food waste, so from an agricultural perspective, if you have parts of the plant that you're not eating and you have hundreds of tons of it, it's much more simple to standardize the quality. So there are some really good waste streams that are good for feeding insects. But yeah, some of them wouldn't be as suitable.
Might be another way to carry your message forward.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. No, I just wanted to remind everybody of the time that it is after 1:30. So maybe we have time for one more question, and then we'll close up, and then we'll have time to circulate if you wanted to go up to Paul directly and ask more questions.
Yeah, that's definitely an important part of talking about insects too. And yeah, that's a really good point. I'll keep that in mind for future presentation. Thank you.
One more question?
Yeah, please.
You said something that kind of surprised me. You said that dung beetles can turn a cow pasture into a net sink for greenhouse gases. I'm just wondering, like, how prevalent is that? Do you know anything more about that?
Well, there's a really good paper that I've read a few times, but I wouldn't have all the numbers directly in my head right now. It was based in Finland. It was looking at pasture that cows were grazing for 5 months of the year. Essentially, so recently they figured out that cow pats are gassing off a lot of greenhouse gases, and a lot more than they previously estimated. So that was a big part of it. It's almost, and I can't think of the relative contributions of burps, farts versus dung, but it is enough that if you have dung beetles, I can send you the paper. It's in Nature Comms 2016. Slade is the author, is the first author, yeah. Actually it's not Nature Comms, it's the one that Science Advances or Science Technology. What science is equivalent to Nature Comms? It's that journal. It's a great paper. So it's a life cycle analysis, yeah, really good.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really enjoyed your presentation. And thank you, everybody, for coming.